Jake Morrison wiped the grease from his hands with an old rag, squinting at the engine of the ancient pickup truck that had been giving him trouble all morning. His small repair shop sat next to his cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by pine trees and mountains. He liked the quiet life after 20 years as a military engineer. No more explosions, no more deadlines, just him and broken machines that he could actually fix. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but he took a sip anyway. The bitter taste made him grimace. He was about to head inside for a fresh cup when the sky darkened suddenly. Jake looked up, expecting storm clouds, but what he saw made him drop his mug entirely. 6 enormous creatures descended from the clouds, their wings spanning at least 50 feet each. At first glance, they looked like dragons from old fairy tales, but these were unlike anything from human mythology. Their scales were pure white, almost translucent, and seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Along their necks and wings, bioluminescent patterns pulsed in soft blues and purples. Their eyes were large and intelligent, a deep violet color that seemed to hold wisdom beyond their years. Jake's military training kicked in immediately. He dove behind his workbench, reaching for the shotgun he kept mounted on the wall. But as the creatures landed in the clearing around his shop, he realized something strange. They weren't attacking. Instead, they were making soft, almost musical sounds like whales singing in the distance. The largest of the dragons, easily twice the size of the others, approached his shop slowly. Its massive head lowered until it was level with Jake's hiding spot. Those violet eyes looked directly at him, and Jake felt something he had never experienced before. It was like having a conversation without words, images, and feelings flowing directly into his mind. The dragon was trying to communicate. Jake saw flashes of images, vast cities among the stars, ships that moved faster than light, and technology that made human achievements look primitive. But there was also something wrong. The images showed pain, dysfunction, and desperation. Jake slowly stood up, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. The dragon's massive head tilted, studying him. The other 5 dragons formed a semicircle behind their leader, all watching Jake with those intelligent eyes. "Okay," Jake said aloud, feeling foolish for talking to what were obviously alien beings. "I don't know if you can understand me, but you're not acting hostile. So I'm going to assume you need something." The lead dragon made another musical sound, and suddenly Jake's mind was flooded with more images. This time he saw the dragon's ship, hidden somewhere in the mountains nearby. It was sleek and organic looking, more grown than built, but something was terribly wrong with it. Systems were failing, energy was depleting, and without repairs, the ship would die completely. Jake rubbed his temples as the mental communication faded. "You need a mechanic," he said, understanding dawning on him. "That's why you came here. You somehow knew I fixed things." The dragon nodded, a very human gesture that looked strange on such a massive creature. Then it did something even more surprising. It carefully reached into what Jake now realized was a pouch-like organ on its chest and withdrew something small and metallic. The object floated gently through the air until it hovered in front of Jake. He reached out cautiously and grasped it. The metal was warm and seemed to pulse with energy. As soon as his fingers closed around it, his mind exploded with information. Language patterns, technical specifications, energy matrices, and propulsion theories flooded his consciousness. It was overwhelming at first, but Jake's engineering mind began to process the information, filing it away in organized patterns. Within minutes, he could understand the dragon's basic language and had a rudimentary grasp of their technology. "My name is Jake," he said, using both English and the new alien language he had just learned. The dragon's eyes widened in surprise and what Jake interpreted as relief. The lead dragon responded, its mental voice now clear in Jake's mind. "I am Zephyr, speaker for our flock. We are the Luminari, travelers between stars. Our ship is dying, and we have searched many worlds for one who might help us. Your species has a reputation among the galaxy's mechanical problems that others cannot solve." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Humans have a reputation? For what?" "For making impossible repairs with insufficient resources," Zephyr replied. "For refusing to accept that something cannot be fixed. For finding solutions that more advanced species overlook. We have heard stories of human engineers who can repair alien technology they have never seen before, using nothing but determination and creativity." Jake felt a surge of pride at that description. It was true that humans had a talent for improvisation and making do with whatever was available. How many times had he fixed complex machinery with nothing but spare parts and stubbornness? "Show me your ship," Jake said, shouldering his tool bag. "I can't promise anything, but I'll take a look." Zephyr's relief was palpable through their mental link. The dragon lowered its body, creating a natural saddle between its shoulder blades. "Climb on. The ship is not far, but the terrain is difficult for your kind to traverse." Jake hesitated for only a moment before climbing onto the dragon's back. The scales were warm and surprisingly comfortable, and he found natural handholds along Zephyr's neck. As they took to the air, Jake got his first real look at the luminary flock. Each dragon was unique, with different patterns of bioluminescence and slightly different body structures. They moved through the air with incredible grace, their wings barely making a sound. The flight took them deep into the mountains, to a hidden valley that Jake had never seen despite living in the area for 5 years. As they descended, Jake saw the ship and understood immediately why the dragons were so desperate. The vessel was beautiful, all flowing curves and organic lines, but it was clearly dying. Its bioluminescent systems flickered weakly, and several sections had gone completely dark. As they landed, Jake was already analyzing the problems he could see from the outside. This wasn't going to be like fixing a truck engine or rewiring a generator. This was alien biotechnology that operated on principles he barely understood. But as he looked at the hope in the dragon's eyes, Jake Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the military, a sense of purpose. "All right," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's see what we're working with." The interior of the luminary ship was unlike anything Jake had ever imagined. The walls curved organically, pulsing with faint light that reminded him of a heartbeat. Everything seemed to be alive, from the floor beneath his feet to the ceiling that arched high above. But the life was fading. Dark patches spread across the walls like infection, and the air itself felt stale and wrong. Zephyr guided Jake through corridors that branched and twisted like blood vessels. The other 5 dragons followed behind, their massive forms somehow fitting through passages that seemed too small. Jake realized the ship was adjusting itself, expanding corridors as needed. "This is our heart chamber," Zephyr explained as they entered a vast circular room. "From here all ship functions are controlled and maintained." Jake stopped and stared. In the center of the room stood something that looked like a massive tree made of crystal and metal. Its branches spread out in all directions, connecting to every surface of the chamber. But many of the branches were withered and black, and the core of the tree pulsed weakly with dying light. "It's a biotechnological neural network," Jake breathed, his enhanced understanding helping him grasp the basics. "The entire ship is one living organism, and this is its brain and nervous system." "Correct," said a new voice. Jake turned to see another dragon approaching, smaller than Zephyr but with more intricate patterns of light along its scales. "I am Helix, our ship's caretaker. I have tended this vessel for 300 of your years, but the damage is beyond my knowledge to repair." Jake approached the central tree carefully, pulling out a small flashlight to examine the blackened sections. What he saw made his blood run cold. The damage wasn't just mechanical failure or wear and tear. Something had attacked the ship's neural network, introducing a kind of technological virus that was systematically shutting down vital functions. "How long has this been going on?" Jake asked, running his hands along one of the withered branches. The surface was cold to the touch, completely lifeless. "The first symptoms appeared 6 months ago," Helix replied. "We were exploring a system near the galactic core when we encountered a derelict vessel. We attempted to rescue any survivors but found only automated systems. Our ship interfaced with their computers to access their databases, and that is when the corruption began." Jake nodded grimly. "Classic mistake. Never plug an unknown device into your main system without proper isolation protocols." He paused, realizing he was lecturing an alien civilization that had been traveling between stars when humans were still discovering fire. "Sorry, I didn't mean to sound condescending." Zephyr's mental voice carried amusement. "Do not apologize for expertise. We came to you because human approaches to problems are often unconventional. Please continue your analysis." Jake spent the next hour examining the ship's systems with Helix's guidance. The biotechnology was incredibly sophisticated, but it operated on principles that were surprisingly familiar. Energy flowed through organic conduits, information was processed by neural clusters, and the ship's various functions were controlled by what amounted to a biological computer system. The virus, however, was purely artificial. It had been designed to infiltrate biological systems, turning the ship's own immune responses against it. Every time the ship tried to heal itself, the virus adapted and spread further. "I've seen something like this before," Jake said, sitting back on his heels. "Not exactly the same, but the principle is similar. During the war in Afghanistan, we dealt with computer worms that used our own security protocols against us. The harder the system tried to protect itself, the faster the worm spread. Can it be stopped?" Helix asked, its mental voice tight with worry. Jake stood up and walked around the central tree, studying the patterns of corruption. His military engineering background was kicking in, combined with years of fixing seemingly impossible problems in his shop. The solution wouldn't be elegant or sophisticated, but it might work. "The virus is using the ship's neural pathways to spread," he explained. "Every connection is a potential route for infection. But viruses, whether biological or technological, have a weakness. They need a host system to survive and reproduce. We cannot simply disconnect the neural network," Zephyr protested. "Without it, the ship would die completely." "Not disconnect," Jake said, a plan forming in his mind. "Isolate and purge. We're going to perform surgery on your ship's brain." He turned to Helix. "I need to understand the ship's architecture better. Can you show me the secondary control systems? The backup networks that would activate if the primary neural tree was damaged?" Helix looked uncertain. "There are redundant systems, yes, but they are primitive compared to the main network. They would only sustain basic life support and minimal propulsion." "Perfect," Jake said. "That's exactly what we need." Over the next several hours, Jake worked with the dragons to map out the ship's entire neural network. The Luminari had incredible patience, answering his endless questions and helping him understand systems that were far beyond human technology. But as complex as the ship was, Jake's approach remained fundamentally simple. "We're going to compartmentalize the infection," he explained, as he climbed inside the central tree's hollow core. "Cut off the virus's ability to spread while keeping the essential functions isolated on clean systems." The work was delicate and dangerous. Jake had to physically disconnect neural pathways while the ship was still partially operational, like performing brain surgery on a patient who needed to stay conscious. One wrong move could shut down life support or damage the ship beyond repair. But Jake had steady hands and decades of experience working with delicate machinery. More importantly, he had something the virus wasn't designed to counter: pure human stubbornness. Every time the virus adapted to his actions, Jake changed his approach. He rerouted power through unexpected pathways, used backup systems in ways they were never intended to be used, and jury-rigged connections that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The dragons watched in fascination as Jake worked. His methods were crude compared to their advanced biotechnology, but they were effective. Where Luminari engineers would have used sophisticated algorithms and elegant solutions, Jake used brute force and creative problem-solving. "Your species truly is remarkable," Zephyr observed as Jake emerged from the neural tree's core, covered in bioluminescent fluid but grinning triumphantly. "I have never seen someone treat advanced technology with such irreverence." "Sometimes irreverence is exactly what's needed," Jake replied, wiping his hands on his shirt. The virus was designed to counter sophisticated responses. It wasn't programmed to deal with someone who would literally rip out its host and rebuild it from scratch. Around them, the ship was beginning to respond. The blackened sections of the neural tree were no longer spreading, contained within isolated segments that Jake had quarantined. The main system was running on a patchwork of backup networks and improvised connections, but it was stable. "The immediate crisis is over," Jake announced. "But this is just emergency surgery. If you want your ship to be fully functional again, we're going to need to do some serious rebuilding." Helix approached the central tree, its eyes wide with amazement. The corruption had stopped spreading, and new growth was already beginning to appear on the healthy sections. "How long will the repairs take?" Jake looked around the chamber, mentally cataloging everything that needed to be done. "With your help? Maybe a week. But I'm going to need some materials from my shop, and you're going to have to trust me to do things that probably violate every principle of Luminari engineering." Zephyr's mental laughter filled the chamber. "Human engineer, after what you have accomplished in a single day, we would trust you to rebuild our entire civilization." The next morning, Jake stood in his workshop gathering supplies while Zephyr waited outside. her massive form somehow managing to look patient, despite her obvious eagerness to return to the ship. Jake stuffed his tool bag with everything he thought might be useful: copper wire, circuit boards, batteries, welding equipment, and a dozen other items that had no business being anywhere near alien biotechnology. This is either going to work brilliantly or blow up in spectacular fashion, Jake muttered to himself as he hefted a car battery. Probably both. The flight back to the Hidden Valley gave Jake time to think about what he was attempting. The Luminary ship operated on principles that were light years ahead of human technology, but at its core, it was still a machine that needed energy, processing power, and stable connections. The virus had corrupted the biological components, but Jake was betting that hybrid biomechanical systems might be immune to future attacks. When they landed, Jake found the other dragons gathered around the ship, their bioluminescent patterns flickering with what he was learning to recognize as anxiety. Helix approached immediately, its mental voice tight with concern. "The quarantine is holding," Helix reported, "but we have discovered additional problems. The virus damaged more than just the neural network. Our energy conversion systems are operating at only 30% efficiency, and the navigation array is completely offline." Jake nodded, having expected as much. "One thing at a time. Let's start with the power systems. Show me your energy cores." The ship's power generation was based on what the Luminary called stellar fusion, a process that captured and concentrated energy from nearby stars. The technology was elegant and incredibly efficient, but the biological components that regulated the fusion process had been corrupted by the virus. Jake studied the energy cores for an hour, his enhanced understanding helping him grasp the basic principles. The system was like a massive biological solar panel combined with a fusion reactor, but the organic control mechanisms were failing. "I have an idea," Jake said finally, "but you're really not going to like it." He pulled out the car battery and began explaining his plan. The dragons listened with growing alarm as Jake described how he intended to replace the failed biological regulators with crude human electronics. "You want to use primitive chemical energy storage to regulate stellar fusion?" Helix asked, its mental voice rising in pitch. "That is like using a stone knife to perform microsurgery." "Sometimes stone knives are exactly what you need," Jake replied cheerfully. "The beauty of simple technology is that it's almost impossible to hack or corrupt. Your virus is sophisticated enough to turn your own systems against you, but I doubt it knows what to do with a 12-volt car battery." The work took most of the day. Jake had to design interface systems that could translate between the ship's biological energy patterns and his electronic components. It was like trying to make a modern computer talk to a telegraph. But Jake had experience with jury-rigged solutions that shouldn't work but somehow did. The dragons watched in fascination as Jake welded copper wire directly to biological conduits, using electrical tape and zip ties to hold everything together. His repairs looked crude and primitive compared to the ship's organic elegance, but they were functional. "Power output is stabilizing," Helix reported with amazement as Jake's hybrid system came online. "Energy efficiency is actually higher than before the corruption." "Redundancy," Jake explained, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Your biological systems are sophisticated, but they're vulnerable. My electronic systems are primitive, but they're reliable. Together, they can compensate for each other's weaknesses." The success with the power systems gave Jake confidence to tackle the navigation array. This was more challenging because it involved the ship's sensory systems, biological organs that could detect gravitational fields, electromagnetic radiation, and what the Luminary called quantum currents that flowed between star systems. The corruption had blinded these organs, leaving the ship unable to navigate safely through space. But Jake had an idea that came from his military experience with damaged radar and communication systems. "We're going to build you new eyes," Jake announced, unpacking a collection of radio antennas, satellite dishes, and electronic sensors he had salvaged from old communications equipment. The dragons watched in bewilderment as Jake constructed what looked like a technological scarecrow on the ship's outer hull. Radio antennas stuck out at odd angles. Satellite dishes were mounted on improvised brackets, and sensors of various types were connected with a maze of cables. "This looks nothing like our organic sensor arrays," Zephyr observed. "That's the point," Jake replied, connecting the last of his electronic sensors to the ship's neural network through one of his hybrid interfaces. Your organic sensors are incredibly sophisticated, but they're also incredibly vulnerable. These electronic sensors are crude, but they're also nearly impossible to corrupt or jam. When Jake activated his improvised sensor array, the results were immediately apparent. The ship's navigation displays, which had been dark for months, suddenly flickered to life. The readings were rough compared to the ship's original sensory capabilities, but they were accurate enough for safe navigation. "I don't understand," Helix said, studying the navigation displays. "How can such primitive sensors provide useful data?" Jake grinned. "Because I'm not trying to replace your organic sensors completely. I'm creating a backup system that operates on completely different principles. Think of it as technological biodiversity. If one system fails or gets attacked, the others can take over." As the week progressed, Jake continued his hybrid repairs throughout the ship. He replaced corrupted biological processors with simple computers, backed up organic memory systems with mechanical hard drives, and created redundant networks that mixed biological and electronic components. The dragons initially resisted his crude methods, but they couldn't argue with the results. Every system Jake repaired became more stable and resistant to corruption. His hybrid approach created a technological immune system that could adapt to new threats without being vulnerable to the same attacks that had crippled their pure biological systems. By the end of the week, the ship was not only functional but actually more capable than it had been before the virus attack. Jake's hybrid systems provided new capabilities that pure biotechnology couldn't match, while the ship's biological components gave Jake's electronics processing power and efficiency they could never achieve alone. "I must admit," Zephyr said as they stood in the heart chamber, looking at the neural tree that now sprouted electronic components alongside its biological branches, "this hybrid approach has merit. Our ship is stronger now than it was before." Jake nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction at a job well done. Sometimes the best solution isn't the most elegant one. Sometimes you just need to make things work, regardless of how they look. But as Jake prepared to return to his cabin, Helix approached with news that changed everything. "Jake," the dragon said, its mental voice grave with concern, "we have received a distress signal. Another luminary ship has been attacked by the same virus that corrupted our systems. They are requesting immediate assistance." Jake looked around at the dragons, seeing hope and determination in their violet eyes. His week of repairs had proven that human engineering could solve problems that had stumped advanced alien civilizations. Now they wanted him to do it again. "How far away are they?" Jake asked, already knowing he couldn't refuse to help. 3 days' flight at maximum speed, Zephyr replied. "But Jake, this ship is much larger than ours. It carries over 1,000 luminari, including many young ones. If we cannot save them..." Jake didn't need to hear the rest. He was already planning modifications to his repair techniques that could be scaled up for a larger vessel. "Then we better get moving," he said. "And we're going to need a lot more car batteries." The journey to reach the damaged luminary ship gave Jake time to plan and prepare. Zephyr's ship now moved through space with a grace that belied its hybrid nature, electronic sensors working alongside biological ones to navigate the complex currents between star systems. Jake spent the 3-day flight learning more about luminary technology and adapting his repair techniques for a much larger scale. "The vessel we seek is called the Harmony Grove," Helix explained as they approached their destination. "It is what you might call a colony ship, designed to carry entire communities between star systems. Its neural network is far more complex than ours, with multiple redundant cores and backup systems." Jake studied the technical schematics that Helix shared through their mental link. The ship was massive, nearly 10 times the size of Zephyr's vessel, with multiple biodomes containing entire ecosystems. But size also meant complexity, and complexity meant more opportunities for the virus to spread and cause damage. The good news is that larger systems usually have better isolation protocols, Jake said. The bad news is that if the virus has compromised the main cores, we're looking at a much bigger repair job. When the Harmony Grove came into view, Jake immediately understood the scale of the crisis. The massive ship drifted dead in space, its bioluminescent systems completely dark except for faint emergency lighting. No responses came from their communication attempts, and their sensors detected only minimal life support activity. "They're alive," Zephyr reported after a deep scan. "But barely. Life support is failing throughout most of the ship. We have perhaps 6 hours before critical systems collapse entirely. Jake felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergency repairs under impossible deadlines. This was what he had lived for during his military career. The moments when everything depended on his ability to make broken things work again. Zephyr's ship docked with the Harmony Grove's emergency ports, and Jake gathered his tools and supplies. He had spent the journey constructing larger-scale versions of his hybrid interfaces, along with portable power supplies and communication equipment that could function independently of the ship's corrupted systems. The interior of the Harmony Grove was a maze of darkened corridors and dying biological systems. Jake followed a small team of dragons from Zephyr's crew through passages that seemed to shift and contract around them as the ship's structural systems failed. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on walls that had once pulsed with vibrant life. They found the ship's primary heart chamber filled with desperate luminari. Dragons of all sizes huddled around the massive central neural tree, which was completely black with corruption. The air was thick with the smell of decay and fear. "Thank the stars," said an elderly dragon with elaborate silver patterns along her scales. "I am Elder Cosmos, keeper of this vessel. We received word that a human engineer had found a way to combat the corruption, but I confess I did not believe it was possible." Jake looked around the chamber, assessing the damage. It was worse than he had feared. The virus hadn't just corrupted the neural network, it had spread to the ship's structural systems, causing the very hull to weaken and fail. But Jake had dealt with seemingly impossible situations before. "I need to understand what happened here," Jake said, setting down his equipment. "When did the corruption begin and how did it spread so quickly?" Elder Cosmos shared the ship's recent history through mental communication. Like Zephyr's vessel, the Harmony Grove had encountered the same derelict ship near the galactic core. But instead of a simple data interface, they had attempted a full systems integration, trying to salvage whatever technology they could from the abandoned vessel. "Classic cascading failure," Jake muttered. "You gave the virus access to everything at once." He paused, realizing he was again lecturing beings far more advanced than humanity. "Sorry, I don't mean to criticize. Under normal circumstances, your approach would have been perfectly safe." "Do not apologize for truth," Elder Cosmos replied. "Our arrogance led us to ignore basic caution." "Can the damage be reversed?" Jake spent an hour examining the corrupted neural tree and the ship's major systems. The situation was far worse than what he had dealt with on Zephyr's ship. The virus had had months to spread and adapt, and it had evolved beyond his original understanding, but that also gave Jake an advantage. He could see the patterns of how the virus operated and where it was vulnerable. "The corruption is total but not irreversible," Jake announced. "However, my previous approach won't work here. The scale is too large and the damage too extensive. We need a completely different strategy." He turned to address the gathered luminari, many of whom were young dragons barely larger than horses. "I'm going to need volunteers. What I'm planning is dangerous, and it requires dragons willing to risk their lives to save the ship." The response was immediate. Every adult dragon in the chamber stepped forward, their mental voices raised in determination. Even some of the younger ones tried to volunteer before their elders gently pushed them back. Jake selected 6 of the strongest dragons and began explaining his plan. Instead of trying to repair the existing neural network, they were going to grow a completely new one using healthy biological components combined with his electronic systems. It would require the volunteer dragons to share their own neural tissue to seed the new network, a process that was dangerous and potentially fatal. "You're asking us to become part of the ship," said one of the volunteers, a dragon named Nebula whose scales shimmered with constellation patterns. "Temporarily," Jake clarified. "Once the new network is established and the virus is purged, we can disconnect your neural links safely. But during the growth process, you'll be directly connected to the ship's consciousness. If something goes wrong, we understand the risks," Elder Cosmos interrupted. "But without this ship, our entire community will die. Proceed with your plan." The next several hours were the most challenging of Jake's career. Working with the volunteer dragons, he began constructing a new neural network from scratch. His electronic components provided the basic framework and protection against viral corruption, while the dragon's biological contributions gave the system the processing power needed to control a ship as complex as the Harmony Grove. The process was incredibly delicate. Jake had to balance biological growth rates with electronic integration, ensuring that the new network could interface with the ship's existing systems without triggering the virus's defensive responses. The volunteer dragons lay connected to his hybrid systems, their consciousness partially merged with the growing network. Neural integration at 60%, reported Helix, who was monitoring the process through portable instruments. Biological growth is proceeding faster than expected. Jake wiped sweat from his forehead, his hands steady despite the exhaustion. Around him, the new neural network was taking shape, electronic conduits branching alongside biological ones in patterns that defied both human and luminary engineering principles. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Virus detected, warned Nebula, her mental voice strained from the neural connection. It's trying to infiltrate the new network. Expected, Jake replied, making rapid adjustments to his electronic countermeasures. This is where human stubbornness beats alien sophistication. The virus knows how to attack biological or electronic systems separately, but it doesn't know what to do with our hybrid approach. The battle between the virus and Jake's hybrid system played out in real time through the neural network. Jake could see the virus probing for weaknesses, trying to use familiar attack patterns against unfamiliar architecture. But every time it adapted to one component, Jake would reroute through another, using the hybrid nature of his system to stay one step ahead. After 6 hours of continuous work, Jake finally sat back with exhaustion and triumph. The new neural network was complete and fully operational. Around the chamber, systems that had been dark for months began to flicker back to life. The ship's structural integrity stabilized, life support resumed normal function, and navigation systems came back online. Disconnecting volunteer neural links, Jake announced, carefully severing the temporary connections that had allowed the dragons to seed the new network. One by one, the volunteers awakened from their trance-like state, tired but unharmed. Elder Cosmos approached the new neural tree, her eyes wide with amazement. The hybrid structure looked nothing like traditional luminary biotechnology, but it was clearly alive and functioning perfectly. You have saved not just our ship, but our entire community, she said, her mental voice filled with gratitude. How can we ever repay such a debt? Jake stood up slowly, exhaustion making his movements clumsy. Just promise me you'll be more careful about connecting to unknown systems in the future, and maybe consider adding some of these hybrid safeguards to your other ships. As the Harmony Grove's systems fully restored, Jake realized that his simple life as a mountain mechanic had changed forever. Word of his success would spread throughout the Luminary community and beyond. He had become something he never expected, the galaxy's premier expert in hybrid biomechanical engineering. 3 weeks after saving the Harmony Grove, Jake's quiet mountain retreat had been transformed into something resembling a small spaceport. 7 different Luminary ships now rested in the hidden valley, their crews working alongside Jake to implement hybrid biomechanical upgrades. Word of the human engineers' success had spread through Luminary space faster than their fastest ships could travel. Jake stood in his expanded workshop, which now occupied several connected buildings that the dragons had grown from their ship's biological materials. The structures looked like a cross between a modern laboratory and a fairy tale cottage, with organic walls that pulsed softly with bioluminescent lighting and electronic equipment mounted on living surfaces. The Stellar Winds navigation array is now complete, reported Helix, who had become Jake's primary liaison with the various dragon crews. Captain Solaris reports that the hybrid sensors are detecting quantum currents with 95% accuracy, compared to 87% with purely biological sensors. Jake nodded, checking another item off his seemingly endless list of upgrade projects. Each ship that arrived brought new challenges and opportunities to refine his techniques. The dragons were quick learners, and many had become skilled at implementing his hybrid designs under supervision. What's next? Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. The work was satisfying, but the pace was becoming overwhelming. The Deep Explorer arrived this morning, Helix replied. It's a science vessel that encountered the virus while studying ancient ruins near the galactic center. But Jake, this situation is different. The virus has evolved. Jake felt a chill of concern. He had expected the virus to adapt eventually, but he had hoped to stay ahead of its evolution with his hybrid countermeasures. How different? Zephyr entered the workshop, her mental voice carrying unusual urgency. The Deep Explorer's corruption is unlike anything we have seen before. The virus has learned from our previous encounters. It is specifically targeting the junction points between biological and electronic systems. Jake set down his tools and rubbed his temples. This was the nightmare scenario he had feared. A virus that could adapt to his hybrid solutions. Show me the data. The technical information that Helix shared through their mental link was disturbing. The evolved virus wasn't just attacking biological or electronic systems separately. It had developed the ability to corrupt the interface points between them, turning Jake's own hybrid solutions into vectors for further infection. It's learning our techniques, Jake muttered, using our own countermeasures against us. He paused, thinking through the implications. We need to see the infected ship immediately. The Deep Explorer was smaller than the Harmony Grove but larger than Zephyr's vessel. It specialized in long-range scientific missions, with advanced sensor arrays and research laboratories that pushed the boundaries of luminary technology. As they approached the ship, Jake could see the signs of the evolved infection. The corruption wasn't spreading in the chaotic patterns he had seen before. Instead, it moved with deliberate purpose, systematically targeting the most critical systems first. Captain Pulsar, the Deep Explorer's commander, met them at the docking port. Her scales were dimmed with exhaustion and worry, and her mental voice carried the strain of weeks spent fighting a losing battle against the infection. "Engineer Morrison," she said, her gratitude evident despite her exhaustion. "We have heard of your successes, but I fear this infection may be beyond even your abilities. The virus seems to anticipate our countermeasures before we implement them." Jake examined the ship's systems with growing concern. The evolved virus was indeed more sophisticated than anything he had encountered. It had developed a kind of technological intuition, predicting likely repair strategies and preemptively adapting its defenses. His standard hybrid approach wouldn't work here. "It's learning too fast," Jake admitted after several hours of analysis. "Every countermeasure I try, it's already prepared for. We need a completely different approach." That night, Jake sat in his cabin staring at technical diagrams and drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The other dragons gave him space to think, understanding that their engineer was wrestling with a problem that could affect their entire civilization. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m, triggered by a memory from his military days. During a particularly difficult mission in Iraq, his unit had been pinned down by an adaptive enemy AI that seemed to predict their every move. The solution hadn't come from superior technology or sophisticated tactics. Instead, they had won by doing something completely irrational and unpredictable. "Chaos," Jake said aloud, startling Zephyr, who had been keeping vigil nearby. "The virus is learning our patterns because we're being logical and systematic. What if we stop making sense?" Jake spent the rest of the night developing what he privately called his insanity protocol. Instead of carefully designed hybrid systems, he would create deliberately chaotic networks that operated on principles so random and contradictory that no logical system could predict or counter them. The next morning, Jake explained his plan to the assembled dragons. Their reaction was exactly what he had expected, polite bewilderment mixed with serious concern for his mental health. "You want to create systems that deliberately malfunction?" Captain Pulsar asked, her mental voice carefully neutral. "Not malfunction," Jake clarified. "Function in ways that make no logical sense. The virus is sophisticated because it operates on advanced principles of optimization and efficiency. But what if we created systems that were intentionally inefficient and illogical?" To demonstrate, Jake began constructing what he called a chaos interface in the Deep Explorer's secondary control room. The device combined electronic components in ways that violated every principle of good engineering. Circuit paths looped back on themselves randomly, power flowed through unnecessary resistors and transformers, and data signals were routed through analog noise generators before reaching their destinations. "This should not work," Helix observed, studying Jake's chaotic creation. "The signal degradation alone should make communication impossible." "It shouldn't work," Jake agreed, "but it does. And more importantly, it works in ways that the virus can't predict or counter." When Jake connected his chaos interface to the Deep Explorer's infected neural network, the results were immediate and dramatic. The virus, encountering a system that operated on no logical principles, couldn't develop effective countermeasures. Its adaptive algorithms, designed to optimize against rational opposition, simply couldn't cope with deliberate irrationality. "The infection is retreating," Captain Pulsar reported with amazement. It's withdrawing from systems connected to your chaotic interface. Over the following days, Jake implemented his chaos protocol throughout the Deep Explorer. Each system was deliberately designed to be inefficient, unpredictable, and illogical. The ship's performance suffered compared to optimized luminary technology, but it was completely immune to viral infection. "I must admit," Zephyr said as they watched the last traces of corruption fade from the Deep Explorer's systems, "your species' capacity for constructive insanity is remarkable." Jake grinned tiredly. "Sometimes the best solution is the one that doesn't make sense to anyone, including yourself." But as word of the Chaos Protocol spread, Jake realized he had created a new problem. The Dragons were beginning to implement chaotic systems throughout their fleet, but they were doing it too systematically. Their attempts to be irrational were still too rational, too predictable. "You can't systematize chaos," Jake explained to a gathering of Dragon engineers. "The moment you create rules for being unpredictable, you become predictable again. Each chaos system has to be unique, created fresh every time without following any established patterns." The implications were staggering. Jake's chaos protocol could protect the luminary from viral attacks, but it required human-style intuitive engineering that couldn't be taught or programmed. The Dragons could learn to implement his designs, but they couldn't create new ones independently. It seems, Elder Cosmos observed during a council meeting, that the galaxy needs human engineers more than we initially realized. "Your species possesses a form of technological intuition that our logical minds cannot replicate." Jake looked around at the assembled Dragons, seeing hope and concern in their violet eyes. His simple life as a mountain mechanic was now permanently changed. He had become not just a repair expert, but the foundation of a new form of engineering that could protect civilization from threats they were only beginning to understand. "I guess I'm not retiring anytime soon," Jake said with a rueful smile, "but I'm going to need a bigger workshop." Mountain Hideaway had become the most important location in Luminary space. The hidden valley now housed a sprawling complex of biological and mechanical structures that defied all conventional architectural principles. Dragon-grown buildings twisted around human-built workshops, creating a maze of laboratories, living quarters, and manufacturing facilities that looked like something from a dream. Jake stood on the observation deck of the central tower, a structure that had grown organically around his original cabin like a technological tree. Below him, dozens of Dragons worked alongside human engineers who had been recruited from across Earth. The integration of human and luminary technology had created something entirely new, a form of engineering that neither species could have achieved alone. "The morning reports." "Jake," said Maria Santos, his chief human assistant, approaching with a tablet full of status updates. Maria had been a NASA engineer before Jake had convinced her to help with what he had described as the most important repair job in the galaxy. 17 new ships arrived overnight, Maria continued, including 3 vessels from species we've never encountered before. Word is spreading beyond luminary space. Everyone wants Chaos Protocol upgrades. Jake accepted the tablet and scrolled through the reports. The success of his unconventional engineering had attracted attention from across the galaxy. Ships from dozens of different species now arrived regularly, their crews desperate for protection against viral attacks that were becoming increasingly common and sophisticated. "Any word from the Galactic Engineering Council?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Maria's expression darkened. "Still demanding that we share our techniques through official channels. They're threatening trade sanctions against any species that receives our services without proper authorization." Jake sighed. The Galactic Engineering Council represented the most advanced technological civilizations in the galaxy, and they were not pleased that a primitive species like humanity had developed solutions to problems they couldn't solve. Their demand for technical specifications and formal documentation completely missed the point of Chaos Protocol engineering. "You can't document chaos," Jake had explained to their representatives during a tense video conference. "The moment you write down how to create unpredictable systems, they become predictable. This isn't technology that can be transferred through blueprints or manuals." The Council's response had been predictably bureaucratic. They insisted that all technological advances must be properly cataloged and shared, according to galactic protocols. The idea that some forms of engineering could only be practiced, not taught, was completely alien to their systematic approach. "Speaking of the Council," Maria said, pointing toward the horizon. "We have incoming ships, big ones, and they're not broadcasting luminary identification codes." Jake raised his binoculars and felt his stomach sink. 3 massive vessels were approaching, their sleek designs and military formations clearly identifying them as Council enforcement ships. He had been expecting this confrontation, but he had hoped for more time to prepare. "Sound the general alarm," Jake ordered.
"Get all visiting ships ready for emergency departure."
"And activate the defensive systems." The defensive systems were Jake's latest innovation, chaotic. Shield generators that protected the valley by creating unpredictable energy patterns that confused targeting systems. They wouldn't stop a determined military assault, but they might buy enough time for the civilian ships to escape. Zephyr appeared on the observation deck, her mental voice tense with concern. "Jake, the Council ships are demanding that all vessels in the valley submit to inspection, and that you surrender yourself for questioning about unauthorized technology transfer." "Over my dead body," Jake replied grimly. "They want to dissect our techniques and turn them into bureaucratic procedures. They don't understand that chaos engineering requires intuition and creativity that can't be regulated." The lead Council ship, a massive dreadnought that dwarfed even the largest luminary vessels, moved into position above the valley. Its captain's voice boomed through speakers that could be heard across the entire complex. "This facility is in violation of Galactic Technology Regulation 847 Alpha. All personnel will submit to immediate inspection, and all unauthorized technological developments will be confiscated for proper evaluation." Jake grabbed the facility's communication system and broadcast his response across all frequencies. "This is Engineer Jake Morrison. Your regulations don't apply here because you don't understand what we're doing. We're not transferring technology. We're teaching a way of thinking that can't be captured in your databases. Surrender now, or we will take enforcement action," the Council captain replied. Jake looked around at the assembled humans and dragons, seeing determination in their faces despite the overwhelming odds. These beings had come from across the galaxy seeking his help, and he wasn't about to abandon them to bureaucratic interference. "All right, people," Jake announced. "Time to show the Council what human engineering is really capable of. Activate Operation Chaos Storm." Operation Chaos Storm was Jake's most ambitious project yet, a facility-wide implementation of Chaos Protocol that turned the entire valley into one massive, unpredictable system. Every building, every ship, every piece of equipment was connected through chaotic interfaces that created a technological environment so complex and irrational that no external system could analyze or control it. The effect was immediate. The Council ship's sensors began receiving contradictory data. Their targeting systems locked onto phantom targets, and their communication arrays picked up signals that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The valley below them had become a technological maze that defied all attempts at systematic analysis. "What are you doing to our systems?" the Council captain demanded, his voice now carrying notes of confusion and alarm. "I'm showing you why some problems can't be solved with rules and regulations," Jake replied. "Your ships are encountering genuine chaos, systems that operate outside the boundaries of logical analysis. Your computers can't predict or counter our responses because we're not following any predictable patterns." To demonstrate his point, Jake activated a series of defensive measures that violated every principle of military strategy. Instead of concentrating firepower or creating unified defensive lines, he implemented scattered, contradictory responses that somehow worked together in ways that made no logical sense. Decoy projectors created false images of ships that moved in impossible patterns. Communication jammers broadcast actual useful information mixed with random noise. Defense shields fluctuated randomly between maximum and minimum power, creating protection patterns that no tactical computer could predict or exploit. The Council ships found themselves completely unable to respond effectively. Every time they adapted their tactics to counter one defensive measure, 3 more would activate using completely different principles. Their advanced military systems, designed to counter logical opposition, simply couldn't cope with deliberate irrationality. "This is impossible," the Council captain transmitted, his voice now carrying genuine respect along with frustration. "Our tactical computers cannot generate effective responses to your defensive patterns. That's because your computers are trying to find logic where none exists," Jake explained. Chaos engineering isn't about building better systems. It's about building systems that work precisely because they shouldn't. After 6 hours of futile attempts to analyze or counter Jake's chaotic defenses, the council ships finally requested a ceasefire. Their captain asked for permission to come down to the facility for direct negotiations, admitting that their long-range analysis systems were completely inadequate for understanding what they were encountering. Jake agreed to the meeting, but on his own terms. The council representatives would be welcomed as guests, not inspectors, and they would observe his operations without demanding technical specifications or trying to impose regulatory frameworks. Captain Vortex of the council. Enforcement Fleet was a member of the Crystalline Collective, a species that had evolved from silicon-based computers and prided themselves on logical perfection. His geometric form sparkled with mathematical precision as he toured Jake's facility, his sensors recording everything but understanding very little. "I must admit," Captain Vortex said as they stood in one of Jake's chaos workshops, watching human engineers create impossible devices with dragon assistance. "This challenges everything we know about technological development. Your methods appear to violate fundamental principles of systems theory." "That's exactly the point," Jake replied. "Sometimes the best solution is the one that breaks all the rules. Your species has achieved incredible technological advancement through logical optimization, but that same logic makes you vulnerable to attacks that exploit systematic thinking." Jake demonstrated by showing Captain Vortex 2 identical devices, one built using traditional, crystalline design principles, and one built using chaos protocol. When he exposed both devices to a simulated viral attack, the logical device was compromised within seconds, while the chaotic device remained completely unaffected. The virus can predict and counter the logical device because it operates on recognizable principles, Jake explained. In the grand assembly hall that had grown around the original heart of his mountain facility, representatives from over 200 species filled the vast space, their diverse forms creating a living tapestry of galactic civilization. Some floated in environmental suits, others projected themselves as holograms, and a few existed as pure energy patterns that shimmered in the air. Today marked the official founding of the Chaos Engineering Institute, the first galactic organization dedicated to developing technological solutions that transcended logical analysis. Jake had never intended to become the leader of a revolutionary movement, but circumstances had forced the role upon him. "Friends, colleagues, fellow engineers," Jake began, his voice carried to every corner of the hall by translation systems that had themselves been built using chaos protocols. 2 years ago, a flock of dragons landed by my cabin asking for help with a broken ship. Today, we're changing the fundamental principles of how the galaxy approaches technological development. The audience included beings that represented the pinnacle of their respective civilizations' achievements. The crystal entities of the Resonance Collective pulsed with mathematical precision. The biomechanical synthesis creatures merged organic and artificial components in ways that defied classification. The energy beings of the stellar consciousness existed as living information, patterns that could inhabit any compatible system, but they had all come to learn from a human mechanic who had revolutionized engineering by abandoning everything their species considered fundamental to technological advancement. Elder Cosmos of the Luminary, now Jake's closest alien ally, approached the podium with the ceremonial documents that would establish the Institute's charter. Her ancient scales had taken on new patterns of bioluminescence, a sign of the profound changes that chaos engineering had brought to her people. "The Luminary Council speaks for all member species," she announced, "when we recognize Engineer Morrison's chaos protocols as the galaxy's primary defense against adaptive viral attacks. But more than that, we recognize the philosophical revolution that human engineering represents." Jake accepted the charter documents, feeling the weight of responsibility they represented. The Institute would train engineers from across the galaxy in chaos protocols, but more importantly, it would teach them to think beyond the logical constraints that had previously defined technological development. "The most important thing you'll learn here," Jake told the assembled representatives, "isn't how to build chaotic systems. It's how to think chaotically, how to embrace solutions that don't make sense, how to trust intuition over analysis." Maria Santos, now the Institute's Director of Human Operations, stepped forward to present the first graduation class of Chaos Engineers. 25 beings from 15 different species had completed the intensive training program that Jake had developed. Unlike traditional engineering education, the Chaos program couldn't rely on textbooks or standardized curricula. Each student had to discover their own path to irrational thinking. The graduation requirement, Maria explained, is simple in concept but profound in execution. Each student must create a functional device that violates at least 3 fundamental principles of their species' engineering traditions. The device must work perfectly while making no logical sense to outside observers. The graduation demonstrations were spectacular. A crystalline engineer had built a computer that processed information by deliberately introducing errors and contradictions. A biomechanical student had created a living machine that grew stronger by damaging itself. An energy being had constructed a consciousness transfer device that worked by forgetting what it was supposed to do. Each project was impossible according to conventional engineering principles, but they all functioned flawlessly. More importantly, they were all completely immune to the viral attacks that had plagued the galaxy for the past several years. But the Institute's greatest achievement wasn't technological, it was philosophical. Jake had proven that logical optimization, the foundation of galactic civilization for millennia, wasn't the only path to advancement. Sometimes the best solutions came from abandoning logic entirely and embracing creative chaos. Captain Vortex of the Crystalline Collective, who had become an unlikely ally after their initial confrontation, approached Jake after the ceremony. The geometric being's form sparkled with new patterns that indicated deep contemplation. "Engineer Morrison," Captain Vortex said, "I must confess that our species has struggled to implement your teachings. Our fundamental nature is based on logical precision. How do we embrace irrationality without losing our essential identity?" Jake had faced this question many times from species whose entire civilizations were built on systematic thinking. "You don't abandon logic," he explained. "You learn when logic isn't enough. The best chaos engineers aren't irrational. They're selectively irrational. They know when to think logically and when to think creatively." To demonstrate, Jake led Captain Vortex to one of the Institute's collaborative workshops, where human and alien engineers worked together on impossible projects. At one station, a team was building a navigation system that deliberately got lost in order to find new routes through space. At another, engineers were creating armor that protected by becoming more vulnerable. "Watch how they work together," Jake said. "The alien engineers provide systematic analysis and logical frameworks. The human engineers provide creative chaos and intuitive leaps. Neither approach works alone, but together they create solutions that transcend what either species could achieve independently." Captain Vortex observed the collaboration with growing understanding. "You are not replacing logic with chaos," he realized. "You are creating a synthesis that incorporates both." "Exactly," Jake confirmed. "The galaxy's future isn't about choosing between systematic thinking and creative chaos. It's about learning to use both approaches as tools, applying whichever one fits the specific problem you're trying to solve." As the day's ceremonies concluded, Jake found himself alone on the observation deck where this journey had begun. The original valley had expanded into a small city that sprawled across several mountain peaks. Ships from hundreds of species came and went regularly, their crews carrying chaos engineering techniques back to their homeworlds. Zephyr joined him on the deck, her massive form settling beside him with the comfortable familiarity of old friends. "Do you ever regret how much your life has changed?" she asked through their mental link. Jake considered the question carefully. His simple life as a mountain mechanic was gone forever, replaced by responsibilities that affected the entire galaxy. He was no longer just fixing broken machines, he was reshaping how civilization itself approached the concept of technological development. "Sometimes," Jake admitted, "I miss the quiet mornings when the biggest problem was a stubborn engine. But then I look at what we've accomplished here and I realize that some repairs are too important to walk away from." Below them, the Institute continued its work. Human engineers taught alien students to embrace creative failure. Alien scientists shared advanced theories with human mechanics who turned them into impossible devices. Species that had never communicated before found common ground in the shared challenge of thinking beyond their logical limitations. "The virus attacks have stopped," Zephyr observed. Our hybrid and chaotic systems have proven so effective that the original virus source has apparently given up trying to develop new attack vectors. Jake nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. That's just the beginning. The real victory isn't that we stopped the viral attacks. It's that we've shown the galaxy a new way of thinking about problems. We've proven that there's always another approach, another solution, if you're willing to think differently enough. A new ship was approaching the valley, its design unlike anything Jake had seen before. As it landed, beings emerged that seemed to be made of living mathematics, their forms shifting through geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The Equation Collective, Zephyr identified. They represent pure mathematical consciousness. If they're here seeking chaos engineering training, then truly no species is beyond the reach of your revolutionary thinking, Jake smiled, feeling the familiar excitement that came with a new engineering challenge. Well then, he said, heading toward the landing pad. Let's go teach some living equations how to be irrational. As he walked down to meet the newest students, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him from a simple mechanic to the founder of a galactic engineering revolution. It had started with 6 dragons asking for help with a broken ship. Now it encompassed hundreds of species learning to solve impossible problems by abandoning the very logic that had previously defined their civilizations. But at its heart, the work remained the same as it had always been, taking broken things and finding ways to make them work again. The only difference was that now, sometimes the thing that needed fixing wasn't a machine or a ship or even a technology. Sometimes it was an entire way of thinking about the universe itself. And Jake Morrison, former military engineer turned mountain mechanic turned galactic revolutionary, wouldn't have it any other way. After all, the best repairs had always been the ones that seemed impossible until someone figured out